My mother went through a Hitler phase in 2001, not out of admiration. She was fascinated by the question of how, like, how did this happen? How did an entire country follow a man off a cliff? How do intelligent, ordinary people convince themselves it was fine? So she bought a few books about him on Amazon. Now, Amazon immediately started filling her, you might also, that section on Amazon, you might also be interested in, with neo-Nazi books, neo-Nazi paraphernalia, things that she didn't even know existed to promote neo-Nazism. And she was never going to buy any of this stuff. And she wasn't really offended. It was just a little bit unsettling because here there was this feeling, and I remember this, her describing it, of being watched and judged by something that had gotten her, understood her completely wrong. And the thing that made it worse was there was really nobody to explain it to. She wasn't a Nazi, and the algorithm had no way of knowing that. And importantly, it had no mechanism for finding out. But that was 2001. It was harmless, right? Weird Amazon suggestions, nothing more. But the same operation, the same logic runs today in systems that determine your insurance rate, your credit score, your parole eligibility, and in at least one documented case, whether your ethnic group gets targeted for violence. Same system, same logic, different stakes. So this is a series about how that happened and why most of us have no idea it's running. Here's the thing that bothered her and that bothered me. And it wasn't so much that Amazon made a mistake in that case. It was that there was something watching her, right? And making this judgment about who she was with no context, no conversation, no ability to hear her side. And there was no version of the interaction where she could in any way correct the record. That was just it. She was just defined that way.
And yeah, because she couldn't call the customer support or customer service and say, hey, I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah. Could you imagine that call? Hey, Amazon, I'm not a Nazi. Can you please stop selling me, putting these things? And even if she could, the Amazon people, it's the person on customer service doesn't know how to fix the algorithm. Are you kidding me? Like they don't, the two different skills. So even if she were able to do, even if she did that, it's not going to fix the recommendations. It's not going to fix the logic because that's all built on how to sell more stuff. The system would find the same pattern in the next person or the next book or the next time she did something. It's not going to fix the issue.
So what's the actual problem? Is it because it's not just bad recommendations? What is the actual problem? Because that's how
so I think that in 2001, it was really just bad recommendations, right? That was really the whole cost. Weird suggestions, a vague sense of unease. But that same operation, observe behavior, strip context, match to a pattern, assign identity, runs inside systems that determine who gets bail and who doesn't, who gets flagged for additional screening and who doesn't, what you're allowed to see on social media, and whether the content around you makes you calmer or angrier. In Myanmar, Facebook's version of this operation contributed to the conditions of ethnic cleansing.
Well, that escalated.
And that's exactly what this series is about, the escalation, because the system didn't change, the stakes did. And most people have no idea how the system works.
But what is the system?
And this is what's interesting because I had no idea how the system works until I started to look into it. But researchers who study this, and I really mean academic researchers who are running experiments and thinking about this in rhetoric and communications and political science, they've identified three things, or let me put it this way. I've identified three things that they say. I'm sure that there are more than three things out there, but these three seem really interesting and really explain a lot. That explain how algorithmic systems do add up to something that we haven't fully reckoned with. And the first one is context collapse. And that's when your behaviors enters a system. The context disappears. Like my mother's curiosity, her horror at fascism, her research instincts, all of that collapses into a transaction of buying a book. Customer purchased a book about Hitler. That data point gets matched to a pattern, and the pattern doesn't know, or it can't know, why you did what you did. The second mechanism here that we'll look at is this idea of affective amplification, which is a very academic term that just means you're building light communities around emotion. So it's this, and because of that, you're amplifying the emotion. So it's not just that algorithms misread you, they actively amplify certain kinds of content, of this emotional content, over others. So that's fear, outrage, moral indignation, not because anybody decided to make people angry, but because emotional content gets more engagement. And
Yeah.
engagement is what the system is operating for, because this is what sells.
Yeah. It optimizes for it all the time. I get that.
And then the third is identity construction. When the system builds a profile of you based on your behavior, your clicks, your purchases, your content, where you live, who you are, who you go out with, what you drive, how you drive, when you drive, that profile gets used to make decisions about you. Now, you didn't consent to the profile. You can't see it, right? In many systems, you can't challenge it. And in some systems, it has the force of law, deciding how you are treated in a legal system.
Three things. And they all start with the Amazon book.
The Amazon book. Well, yeah, every time. The Amazon case is a toy version of the system. It's like the early version. This is 25 years ago, if you can believe that. But it changes what people believe, who gets punished and who gets hurt. So
Mm.
let me take you through exactly what happened to my mother. Not the shopping experience, but the logic, right? Because she
Yeah.
sat down at her computer in 2001. She'd been reading about the Second World War. She wanted to understand how it was possible. She bought a book, right? We call it whatever, the autobiography of Hitler or the rise of the Nazi Party, Mein Kampf, written by an academic, written by whomever, available at the library. But what does Amazon see?
Just ding, somebody bought
Yeah,
something.
a transaction. That's the entire input. It knows nothing about why she was there. No context about why she brought it. No information about what she is and who she is and what she isn't and what she is. Just this account, this product, and this date. And then the algorithm does its thing. It looks for every other customer who purchased that same book, maybe two or three other things, and what did they buy? And the system finds a pattern. Some percentage of people who buys this book or these combinations of book about Hitler also buy
These
whatever,
other things.
whatever things, things that historians probably wouldn't buy, right? And it's because the recommendation engine's job is to surface things that you're likely to buy, not things you should buy, not things that reflect who you are, just things that match the pattern of people who bought what you bought.
Yeah. So it's not making a judgment, it's making like a statistical prediction.
And that's what makes it feel so strange. Like from the outside, you're watching the screen fill up with neo Nazi recommendations. It feels like judgment. It feels like there's something deciding who you are.
Because the recommendation looks to you, it looks like an opinion.
And it is an opinion, right? It's just not one that can hear your side. The term for what happened is context collapse. So my mother's behavior, buying a book for a very specific, very reasonable reason, entered a system that stripped the reason out entirely. What the system retained was the behavior divorced from its meaning, and then it matched that meaningless behavior to a pattern and drew a conclusion. The conclusion was wrong, but the system had no way to be wrong because it had no mechanism for right. It had no concept of intention, only the pattern.
And there's no appeal. You can't appeal to that.
And there's no appeal. There's no court. There's no, oh, actually, here's what I meant, right? The judgment has been rendered. The recommendations appear on your screen. And the only way to correct the record is to buy different stuff, right? To feed the system different data, hoping that it updates the pattern. You can't really argue your way out of it. And here's why this isn't a fixable bug. It's not like Amazon could, with better programming, understand my mother's intent, right? The problem is structural. These systems observe behavior at scale. We're talking hundreds of millions of transactions, clicks, purchases, searches, watch times. And to extract patterns from that much data, you have to strip it down to what's measurable. You can't
Hmm.
measure curiosity. You can't measure horror. You can't measure, oh, I'm a normal person who bought a normal book for normal reasons.
You can only measure what actually happened.
And what actually happened in a way that's recordable and comparable. A click is a click, a purchase is a purchase. The system can't distinguish between a historian and a true believer buying the
Mm.
same book because the distinction lives in the mind, and the minds are not directly accessible to algorithms yet. But
I like how you say that.
yet. Hopefully, we still have a while. So, Dana Boyd is the researcher who studied this extensively. She's the one who coined this term context collapse. And she originally coined it to describe something that's actually slightly different. And it's how social media collapses the audience for everything that you share. So, let's say you
Mm.
share something with a close friend, and that close friend has the context about who you are, what you meant, what kind of day you're having. And then when you share that thing on Twitter, you're suddenly talking to your boss, your grandmother, a journalist, and an algorithm, right? And so you're talking to everybody simultaneously, and nobody has the same context. So your words collapse into this flat text that anyone can read however they want.
Yeah. And so Amazon does the same thing to your behavior that Twitter does to your words. It's like,
Yeah, because both systems are taking something human, communication, action, intention, and strip it down to what can be processed at scale. And what can be processed at scale never includes the most human parts, why you did it, who you are, and what it means.
this applies everywhere, right? The behavior is recorded.
So this is why this is so important, because it applies everywhere. Your browsing history, your location data, your financial transactions, your health records, your cars are tracking everything you do. Every time a system processes your behavior, it can draw a conclusion about you. And that happens hundreds of times a day in systems you've never even heard of, that you didn't even realize were tracking you. So context collapses, and what's left is that pattern that thinks it knows who you are. In the Amazon case, the cost of being misread is weird recommendations, which is annoying, but ultimately harmless.
Yeah.
But now let me tell you about a case where the cost was a person's freedom. So this is a famous case. Eric Loomis was arrested in Wisconsin in
Yeah.
2013, driving a car that had been used in a shooting. Now, he was eventually convicted of resisting arrest. There wasn't enough evidence to convict him of the shooting. For whatever reason, don't know, not opining on whether he did the shooting or not. The point is that he was convicted for resisting arrest. Now, when it came to sentencing, the judge used the output of a risk assessment algorithm called Compass. So it's the Correctional Offender Management Profiling Alternative Sanctions algorithm, right? And what Compass does is it takes in data about the defendant. There's actually a big survey that you fill in, and it looks at your criminal history, age, employment history, community ties, and lots of other factors. And it produces a risk score and a recommendation for sentencing.
And okay, so that sounds potentially useful, right? Courts use all kinds of experts in assessments.
And sure, right, they do. Here's the difference, though. When a human expert gives you an assessment, you the defendant can question them. You can see their reasoning. You can challenge their
Yeah.
methodology. You can say, hey, you got this wrong because you didn't know about this thing over here. The expert can be cross-examined. Their credentials can be disputed. The reasoning can be shown to be flawed, right? Like, you have that option to appeal. But Eric Loomis couldn't examine the Compass algorithm. He couldn't how it was weighted or how the factors came together to suggest the sentence. He couldn't challenge the methodology. The Compass even makes the entire algorithm a trade secret. So nobody can go in and open that black box and see what's going on.
Yeah. So he was sentenced based on something he couldn't see or even question.
Based on this profile, based on this algorithm that he had no access to, no ability to challenge, no way to correct it if it was wrong. And he ended up in jail for 6 years or he ended up sentenced for 6 years. I don't know how many years he served, but ended up sentenced for 6 years because the algorithm rated his risk of recidivism. And then the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld the use of the score, upheld the use of
Mm.
the program, even though they couldn't tell what was going on in it either. And it's the same operation: behavior in, context stripped, pattern matched, identity assigned, and the output feels like a verdict. In this case, it actually was a
Was
verdict.
the verdict.
And my mother couldn't convince Amazon that she wasn't a Nazi, but that only affected her buying recommendations. Eric Loomis couldn't convince the court that his risk score was wrong, right? So the mechanism is identical. The consequences are my mother had wrong recommendations. He ended up in jail.
Yeah, it's brutal.
So here's what I want to bring this back to, right? This isn't three separate problems. It's the one operation producing different consequences depending on where the output lands. Amazon uses it to recommend products, weird things that you don't want to buy, fine. A hiring platform uses it to screen resumes. The stakes, you don't get the interview or a job you're qualified for, and you never find out why, because the system rejected you before a human ever saw your application. A
Yeah,
credit system uses it to assign you a score. The stakes, you pay higher interest rate. You get rejected for a mortgage or can't rent an apartment based on a pattern that the system built around people who share your data profile. Immigration systems uses it to flag travelers for additional screening. You know, the stakes, you miss your flight, you get detained, you end up in alligator whatever in Florida, right? A criminal court uses it for sentencing. The stakes, you go to prison for longer than you otherwise would have, or at all, based on a score that no one can explain to you.
and in every case, you can't argue back. There's
In
nobody to
every
argue.
case, there's no mechanism for reading your intent. There's no mechanism for hearing your side. The context has already been collapsed. The pattern has already been matched. The identity has already been assigned.
None of this is illegal. Why is this not illegal, Jeff? How is this not illegal, Jeff?
And most of it isn't regulated at all, right? These systems just operate out in the wild, and they're proprietary algorithms, they're trade secrets, and they have no requirement to explain their conclusions, only a requirement to show that, hey, I'm improving your results as a judge. I'm making your life easier as a judge or as a bank or as somebody else. You have the legal right to know your credit scores, but you may not have any legal right at all to know why a hiring algorithm rejected you. So there's a bigger picture here. And this is the thing that the series is really about. We tend to think of persuasion as something that happens between humans. Someone makes an argument, you evaluate it, you decide, maybe you change your mind, maybe you don't. But you were in the conversation, you had a chance to respond. What we're talking about with algorithmic systems is a different kind of persuasion, or maybe a kind of persuasion so different that we need a different word for it, right? It doesn't argue, it constructs, it builds you a world, a feed, a profile, an information environment. And that construction shapes what you believe, what you fear, who you think is like you and who isn't. And unlike a bad argument, which you can push back on, which you can say, hey, that's not true, or you're missing context, or you can't argue back at an algorithm. You don't even know that an argument was being made.
Yeah, that's actually unsettling. When you say that out loud, that is like terrifying.
And I think it should be, because it means that so many of these consequential arguments are being made about who you are, arguments that affect where you work, how much you pay, how long, how you're punished, right? Are all being made by systems that you can't see, based on logic that you can't access, with conclusions that you can't refute. And I wanted to stop on this prison thing a little bit, because I've talked about prison and I've said, hey, how long you're in prison. And I think there's a logical response to that that says, I'm not going to prison. I never committed any crimes. But some of this is now being used for preventive policing, where they can decide maybe that you committed a crime before you committed a crime. So you could be exposed to some of these things in ways that you never imagined, not because you did anything, but because the algorithm constructed a view of you. And it's just not a technology problem, it's a rhetoric problem. And it's one that we're only starting to understand. So here's where this gets uncomfortable. And I don't mean, what the systems are doing to other people, what they're doing to you, to how you think.
Meaning the information environment that they're building for you.
For you, for me, for all of us, because it isn't just that algorithms misread who you are, it's that they actually shape who you become and how you think. So when a social media platform's algorithm surfaces certain content consistently, content that makes you afraid or angry or certain that people who disagree with you are not just wrong but evil, you are being constructed in a way, right? Your opinions, your emotions, your sense of what's normal and what's threatening, all of this is being tuned by a system that has no interest in your beliefs being accurate. It only cares that you stay.
Yeah. So it's not just that it misread your mom, right? It's that consistent misreading at scale that changes what people believe.
Yeah, and at scale, it changes what people believe reality looks like. Facebook's own internal research, which we know about because of a whistleblower named Frances Haugen, when she released it, showed that their algorithm knew it was amplifying divisive and extreme content. They knew it. And they were okay with it because extreme content gets more engagement. And engagement is the metric because engagement leads to ads, which leads to revenue. They weren't trying to make people angry. They were trying to maximize engagement. Making people angry was just what worked.
Yeah. And that's what they call effective amplification, right?
Right. And that's so episode 2. So we'll go deep on it in episode 3. But for right now, just realize that the information environment isn't neutral. It was built by a system optimizing for your attention. And the cheapest, most reliable to get human attention is fear, outrage, and moral threat. That's what gets amplified. So, just to give you a little taste of this is in Myanmar in 2017, the military carried out a campaign of violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority that the UN has called ethnic cleansing. So, over 700,000 people were displaced, thousands were killed, villages were burned.
Yeah.
And Facebook was the dominant information platform in Myanmar at the time. And for many people, it was the internet, it was news. And Amnesty International actually went back and documented what happened on the platform and documented how this anti Rohingya content created coordinated campaigns designed to spread this dehumanizing propaganda that was amplified by Facebook's engagement algorithm. And moderate voices and appeals for understanding, factual corrections, they didn't perform. They didn't have the same engagement. So they didn't get shared. They got less reach. And the algorithm surfaced what performed: hatred, fear, dehumanization. And so the algorithm wasn't arguing that the Rohingya deserved violence or wasn't against the Rohingya. It just created an information environment in which that conclusion felt obvious and widely shared. And the UN fact finding mission found that Facebook played a determining role in spreading hate speech that contributed to the violence. And Amnesty International called it social atrocity. Same operation as the Amazon recommendation: behavior in, context strip, pattern matched, extreme content surfaced. But the stakes were not weird shopping suggestions, the stakes were genocide.
So I don't just want to sit in how bad this is. What do you actually do with this?
And that's one of the things that I want to explore and try to understand. I think for now there are two things that are different in scale. And the small thing, the thing that you can do today, is to apply this one question to your information environment, right? Like, why am I seeing this? And not even as an accusation, but as a genuine question. Every time a piece of content makes you angry, every time a recommendation appears, every time your feed surfaces something that confirms exactly what you already believed, I think you have to come back and say, what is the system optimizing for? Is it optimizing for my understanding or is it optimizing for my attention? Because the answer is almost always that it's optimizing for attention, which means that the emotional intensity of what you're seeing is a feature, right? Not a reflection of reality.
Yeah. So the thing that feels most urgent and real might be the thing that's most aggressively amplified.
Yeah, exactly. The most outrage producing content in your feed is not necessarily the most important. It's the most engagement producing content. And those aren't the same thing.
And the second thing,
But the bigger thing, and the thing the series is building towards, is understanding the system well enough to ask different questions of it, right? Who designed the incentives? What would it look like to design them differently? How can we encourage regulation of it, right? Because this isn't inevitable. These algorithms were built by people making decisions, and they could be built differently. They've been built differently in contexts where the incentives are different. So the question is whether we understand them well enough to demand something better. So the algorithm decided my mother was a Nazi, and she wasn't. There was nothing she could do to correct the record. That was 2001, and it was harmless. So we've spent the time since giving the same system more data, more authority, and more stakes. In the next episode, Context Collapse, why the most important thing about you never makes it into the system.